If you're still awake, there's probably a reason. This is Boring History Nights, where history doesn't speak loudly, but long enough to hush the dark. You didn't come here for answers. Maybe not even for sleep. Maybe just to be somewhere soft. Here, the stories don't push. They float through thin walls, under closed doors, along streets you were never meant to walk alone. The air doesn't move. Somewhere, a chair creaks, or maybe it's just your breath brushing the quiet. Dust lingers mid-fall, as if history paused. Whatever warmth you carried, it wouldn't have lasted the night. Let's not stretch this too fast. If something about this quiet spiral makes the night pass easier, you can subscribe. Only if you'd want to hear the next one drift by. And if you're still awake, say where the night found you. I read them all, even the ones that don't remember how they got here. Now let the dark stay dark. Let whatever follows arrive slowly, like it's always been here. You don't have to keep up. Just listen. This is Boring History Nights, and you're already inside it. You step into a nameless street, where the doors never close all the way, and the cobblestones feel warmer than they should. It isn't night yet, but already the shutters have given up their purpose. The light comes in sideways, as if it, too, is unsure of its welcome. No signs, no heraldry, not even graffiti scratched by bored apprentices or careless boys. Just a curve in the road that everyone seems to forget exists, until they need something they're not meant to name. You don't ask directions here. You find it, or it finds you. The houses are close together, unnaturally so, like teeth that have learned how to bite without ever being cleaned. Wood frames warp around stained plaster. There's a sourness in the air that isn't rot but isn't not either. Someone once tried to mask it with boiled sage and lavender, but even that has faded into something bitter and tired. A woman leans in a doorway. She isn't selling anything, not yet. She's watching, you, or the next man, or no one. Her dress is clean in the way cloth gets after too many washes thin, with honesty showing through in places that used to be lined. Her eyes don't blink. You're not the first shadow today. You won't be the last. They call it a red light district now, but there were no lights in this part of town. Not real ones. Just candles, and not for ambiance. They were practical and dangerous. Wax burned down quicker in damp air, especially in rooms with heavy curtains and girls who often forgot to extinguish flame in their rush to get dressed again. Even the term district is generous. It implies structure, zones, civic tolerance. But in truth, medieval red light districts were more like bruises ignored if hidden, punished if shown too clearly. These spaces existed between what the city condemned and what it quietly allowed. Most often, they flourished near markets, ports, or pilgrimage routes, places where men arrived tired, drunk, or lonely, sometimes all three. And yet this street, the one you're in, wasn't a place of chaos. Not in the way that sermons warned. It had rhythms, gentle ones, predictable, even. She would open the shutter by mid-morning. He would pass by before noon with bread no longer fresh enough to sell, offering it in exchange for just a bit of looking. The local guards would cough, not speak as they passed, making just enough noise for everyone to know they were checking in without seeing anything at all. The women here weren't what later books would pretend them to be. They weren't all fallen, wicked, or lost. Most were just tired. Tired in the bones, not just the body. They did what they had to, not with defiance, not with resignation, but with something quieter than both. A kind of invisible shrug that said, "It's this, or the street, and this is the street." In some towns, like London or Avignon, the authorities attempted regulation. Brothels could be sanctioned, taxed, even inspected, but not here. This was the back edge of a nameless village, or a poor quarter of a middling city no one drew maps for. Here, everything blurred. Morality, legality, identity, all smudged like soot on a tavern wall. You could write your name in it, but by morning it would be gone again. There is a door now, in front of you. It has no knob, no knock, just a rough ring of iron. You hesitate to lift it, not because you're afraid of what's inside, but because part of you isn't sure this is real. The sound of your boots on wet stone is the only thing tethering you to now, and yet something draws you. Inside, a stair creaks under your weight. The room above is small, square, and smells of wax, sweat, and something herbal, maybe pennyroyal or rue. Both were used for reasons no one said aloud. There's a basin in the corner, half full of water with petals floating on top. Not for beauty, just to mask the smell of the last man. And on the bed, not yet fully made, lies a piece of bread wrapped in cloth, stale, probably from the man who passed by this morning. It will be eaten, not out of hunger, but routine. Hunger is too grand a word for the small, constant ache that lives here, like a second skin. You sit down on the stool near the hearth. It's cold. The fire hasn't been lit today, not worth the wood. Outside, bells ring faintly. Vespers, maybe, but they sound too far, like they're tolling for someone else's life. The candle flickers, not romantically, but with irritation, as if the draft is taunting it. Shadows curl along the uneven walls, forming shapes you almost recognize: a woman brushing her hair, a man lacing his boots, a child peering through curtains too tall for her, and then nothing, just breath, yours, hers, the house's. You remember reading once that some medieval towns designated red belts, red sleeves, or red veils to identify women of the night. But here, no one wears red. Red draws the eye. These women do not want to be seen. They want to survive. Red is for memory. This street is for forgetting. The medieval red light district wasn't built. It wasn't even designed. It formed like mold, like rot, like the way sorrow settles in corners where joy used to live. It wasn't announced, mapped, or blessed. It just happened, quietly, because people wanted what they wanted, and because some had nothing left to sell but the one thing others still paid for. And you walk it not as a man, or woman, or customer. You walk it as a witness, as someone who knows that even silence leaves footprints. Some streets never get named, not because no one cared, but because too many did, and none of them out loud. The curtain doesn't move, but you feel her watching, not with interest, not with disdain, just with the kind of still, studied attention that doesn't belong to curiosity, but to survival. The linen draped across the window is yellowed and thinning, edged with soot, and likely older than her. She's folded it back just enough to let one eye see through. Not both, just one. That's all she needs. You don't know her name, and even if she told you, it wouldn't be the first, maybe not even the fifth. Names in this place are like candles, useful until they melt down or flare out, then quietly replaced. What she watches for isn't danger, exactly, nor is it opportunity. It's timing. The way some farmers know when to harvest by the air, she reads men like that from their walk, the slouch of their shoulders, how close they get to the edge of the gutter without meaning to. There's no sign on the door. There's no invitation written in chalk or hung on a hook. This is not a brothel in the theatrical sense. This is a house, one of many, and behind the curtain is a woman who didn't choose the job so much as outlast every other option. She doesn't wave. She doesn't lean. She doesn't beckon. That would make it a performance. This is not a performance. Her fingers rest against the windowsill, and they are not soft. They are not adorned. They are not painted or pampered. They are fingers that scrub floors before they touch flesh, that patch clothes before they unlace them, that press against walls to feel if water has begun to seep through again. They are fingers that survive. And still, for those outside, she represents something unspeakable. Not unspeakable in the way of horror, unspeakable in the way of hypocrisy. The same men who avoid her eyes in the daylight, who cross themselves at the cathedral door, return in the hush of evening to place coins on her windowsill, and she takes them, not gladly, not bitterly, just as part of the same ritual, because affection here isn't free, and it never pretended to be. But more than that, it never pretended to be love. Love asks for patience, for listening, for something soft beneath the weight. Here, what's asked for is something else entirely: silence, speed, sometimes mercy, but never love. Because love can be withheld, this cannot. It's offered like bread in a famine, not because it's sweet, but because it's the only thing that keeps the ribs from showing. And the irony, of course, is that sometimes it does look like love, in moments, in gestures, in the way she might adjust the blanket after he leaves, not for warmth, but because the creases irritate the skin, in the way he might leave a coin heavier than necessary, not to be generous, but because he remembered her name that day and didn't know what to do with that. Bread, not love, pay the rent, that was the truth of it. In this district, if you could call it that, coin wasn't always metal. It came in many forms: a loaf, a handful of dried lentils, a soap stub from a wealthy house, a patch of beeswax, even an old ribbon, if it had color left. Things exchanged here weren't about price. They were about proof that someone still had something left to give. And what they gave her was a reminder that she still existed, at least to someone, for at least a little while. This was not poverty as depicted in sermons. This wasn't sackcloth and ash and wailing repentance. This was slow, dense, habitual poverty, the kind that doesn't announce itself with hunger, but with the absence of choices. The kind of poverty that sits down beside you when you're 11 and stays there. That teaches you how to recognize which boots mean trouble and which mean loneliness. She knew all of them by sound. Even now, behind the curtain, she could hear the heel of a farmer who didn't want to talk, the dragging pace of a soldier too drunk to remember the way home, the pause of a married merchant deciding whether tonight would be the night he gave in. They rarely said much, and neither did she. Words, in this place, are like dust on the rafters, only disturbed if something goes wrong. Her voice wasn't trained to seduce. It was trained to reassure, then disappear. Not in pitch, but in presence. She made herself easy to forget, because to be remembered meant someone might try to find you again. And no one in this street wants to be found. They want to be left alone until they're needed, then alone again. And yet, every so often, someone asked, not "Do you love me?" That would have been absurd, laughable even, but something worse. Do you mind? Do you mind the shape of me? The smell? The time of night? The noise? The silence? And she would always answer the same way with her hands, because her hands could tell any story a man wanted to hear, and none of them were hers. Still, there was a kind of care here. Not kindness, necessarily, but attentiveness. The way she folded her shawl beneath his head so the splintered headboard wouldn't scratch. The way she opened the window just after he left so the air could clear before the next one. The way she kept water in a pewter cup beside the bed, not because they asked, but because they sometimes forgot to. Even care becomes ritual if done enough times. Outside, The church bell rang again. Not loudly, not proudly, just as a habit like everything else. And no one in the alley paid it much attention, certainly not her. In some towns, women like her were required to wear ribbons of a certain color, often yellow, sometimes blue, not to shame them, exactly, but to mark them, to categorize desire. But in this district, there were no such colors. There were only shadows. And that was enough. There's a strange piece to repetition, even this kind, even when it's paid for in flesh, because in a world where hunger and disease and war change everything without warning, there's comfort in knowing that at least here, the blanket will always be the same, the footsteps will always return, the curtain will always fall back into place. And so she watches, behind linen, behind history, behind herself. You walk past her window now, slowly, not because you're deciding anything, just because there's something about the stillness that feels like it's watching back. You wonder if she ever wanted something else. Not grand, not dramatic, just different. A different street, a different room, a different man, or no man at all. But then the curtain falls closed again. Not abruptly, just quietly, as if it was never open. There was once a man who left a coin so heavy it cracked the dish it was placed in. No one knew where he got it, but everyone knew why he gave it. Guilt. Most assumed gratitude. Whispered a few. But she, the one who received it, said nothing. She simply lifted the broken dish, folded the cloth beneath it, and kept them both. That was the kind of love this street dealt in quiet gestures, kept to oneself, never spoken of again. You begin to understand that this place, this so-called medieval red light district, isn't a corner of sin the way sermons framed it. It's not lust paraded in silk or temptation wrapped in perfume. No, it's more elemental than that. It's a market of warmth fleeting, negotiated, rationed like bread during famine. Each exchange is as much about the illusion of being seen as it is about the act itself. And illusions, like candles, must be managed carefully. Too much flame, and the wax runs. Too little, and the darkness creeps in. There's a woman sitting by the hearth in the next house. She's mending a sleeve, the needle moving steadily through fabric that's long past the point of revival. Her hair is pinned with the precision of someone who no longer cares about beauty but needs control. In the dimness, her movements are graceful, not in the way a court lady might be praised, but like someone who has memorized the rhythm of necessity. Someone knocks, not loudly, just enough to be heard by her, and no one else. She doesn't rise immediately. She finishes her row of stitching, ties it off, and places the garment beside the hearth before walking to the door. Her robe is fastened tightly. Nothing about her posture suggests seduction. It suggests routine. The man at the door does not speak. He hands her something, a scrap of cloth, or perhaps a coin, and she nods. Not in greeting, in agreement. A transaction has been silently sealed, and she leads him inside without looking back. In towns across Europe, Paris, London, Bruges, places like this operated under tacit toleration. Civic authorities knew they existed and often allowed them to continue as long as they remained discreet and contained. Sometimes they were confined to certain districts. Other times they were scattered across alleys like these, hidden in plain sight. Laws varied wildly. In some places, women in the trade were permitted to operate openly as long as they paid taxes. In others, they were hunted when convenient, only to be quietly ignored when the city coffers ran low. Still, despite legal ambiguity, there were rules here, not written ones, not posted or enforced by officials. These rules were passed between women in whispered phrases, exchanged with a glance, confirmed by bruises or the lack of them, rules about which men you didn't allow in unless another was nearby, about which windows you kept half closed after market day, about which names you never repeated, even if they brought more coin than most. And just as the women learned to navigate these codes, so too did the men. Though theirs were more about when to arrive, how to pretend, and who never to mention. Many came with the air of detachment, as if they had stumbled here by accident. Others walked in with practiced guilt, already rehearsing the confessions they'd offer to their priest or their wife. But some walked in like ghosts, as if this was the only place they still believed they could be touched without vanishing completely. And yet, for all the pain that clung to this alley like mildew, it wasn't without its strange fragments of intimacy. There was an old stool in one of the rooms, worn smooth by countless visits, and on it sat a tin box that held a comb, a cracked mirror, and 3 ribbons. The comb was functional. The mirror barely reflected anything at all, but the ribbons, they were for the women, not to wear, but to hold. Each one a relic from a time before a dance in summer, a friend who had vanished, a sister who had once run her fingers through your hair and told you that you would be more than this. Those ribbons weren't displayed. They were folded and hidden beneath the mattress, between wall panels, or under floorboards. They weren't reminders of loss. They were evidence of something softer having existed, even if briefly. And this, perhaps, is the quiet truth of the medieval red light district. It was never about lust alone. It was about memory. Not memory as in recollection, but memory as currency, the ache of something remembered just long enough to make it feel like it still lived beneath the skin. A man once brought a flower with him, picked from a roadside bush, no doubt, and left it behind when he went. The woman who found it didn't throw it away. She placed it in a cup and let it rot slowly, watching its petals wrinkle and collapse inward day by day, as though the act of decay itself offered companionship. When it finally blackened and curled into nothing, she placed the stem behind the hearthstone and never mentioned it again. Some would say that was foolish, sentimental. But here, where every object might carry a whisper of care, nothing was too small to keep. Outside, the town carried on. Children ran barefoot in the mud. Merchants yelled their wares, and donkeys pulled carts heavy with apples and disappointment. Above the red light street, laundry lines flapped between windows' aprons, tunics, linen stiff with starch or stained with work. Life pulsed on, often unaware or intentionally ignorant of the quiet dramas unfolding one street away. And the city liked it that way. For all its condemnations and sermons, for all its church bells and civic proclamations, it needed this alley, needed it the way a soldier needs an old wound to remember what he survived, quietly, shamefully, persistently. And still the women endured. One of them, older than most, had taken to keeping records, not names, not amounts, but weather. She wrote them on scraps of parchment with the stub of a quill, tucked between floorboards when finished. She believed the seasons shaped the men more than the moons. Rain brought melancholy, wind brought urgency, snow brought desperation, and summer brought danger, always. She was not wrong. Not every woman here stayed long. Some were taken, some were lost to fever, some simply vanished. No note, no name, no trace. Their absence was not marked with mourning. Mourning required ceremony, and there was none to spare here. Their rooms were emptied, linens washed, coins collected, and the door opened again. But she remembered them. In silence, in tiny gestures, the way she folded a blanket twice instead of once, or the way she avoided the corner of a room where someone used to hum while braiding her hair, The memory of these women lingered not in monuments, but in the resistance to forget. The medieval red light district was not built on stone or commerce. It was built on breath, on moments held too tightly, and others let go too soon. You pause now, outside another window, and catch the faint glimmer of candlelight. Not romantic, not inviting, just there, like a heartbeat. And you wonder not what goes on behind the walls, but how many lives folded themselves into these narrow spaces without ever being noticed. There were rules here, though, none you could find nailed to a door or carved above an entrance. No parchment declared them. No town crier announced them. These rules were passed along the way. Dusk passes across rooftops unhurried, unspoken, and unquestioned. They lived in gestures, not ink. They were taught without being taught. They moved from woman to woman, the same way hunger moves across a table slowly, silently, and always felt before it was seen. She learned them the way one learns to breathe in a place with thin air, not all at once, and not without consequence. Her first mistake had been assuming the man who smiled most was safest. He wasn't. Smiles here meant little. Safety meant less. The only thing that carried weight was awareness. You had to watch what others didn't, which shoes tracked in mud even when it hadn't rained, which customers never drank from the cups they were offered, which fingers trembled just before they touched. In this street, silence wasn't absence. It was structure. It divided those who lasted from those who didn't. The ones who spoke too freely left too soon, if not by force, then by the slow erosion of trust. Words here cost more than flesh. They built the bones of survival, and when broken, they could not be mended. The women were expected to know these rules without being told. You never opened your door after the third bell unless you had no choice. You never accepted coin wrapped in cloth unless you recognized the fabric. You never mentioned the priest, even when he mentioned you in his sermons. And you never, we repeat, never spoke about the girl who disappeared last winter. Her name had become one of the rules unspoken, unforgettable, and too dangerous to remember aloud. There were also rituals, smaller and stranger. Every woman in the alley tied back her hair with a strip of linen before nightfall, not for vanity, but for uniformity. It wasn't about beauty. It was about erasure. If you looked the same as the others, the blame blurred. So did memory. So did blame. Some of them left sprigs of rue by their doorframes, not because they believed in magic, but because they couldn't afford disbelief. Others rubbed salt into their sleeves, not visible, not spoken of, but always present. They learned to tuck knives not into boots, but into the folds of bed linens, not to stab, just to show, if needed. That was usually enough. Even the way they looked at one another followed a kind of rhythm. You met eyes for exactly as long as it took to read intent. Then you looked away, not out of shame, out of mutual preservation. A longer glance could mean a question. Questions were dangerous. Questions suggested change, and change here meant risk. No one asked where you were from. No one asked why you stayed. It wasn't kindness. It was economy. Yet among these coded silences, there was something close to intimacy, though not the kind anyone ever named. A woman who noticed another's limp would shift the basin closer before it was asked. A girl who'd been crying wouldn't be asked why, but her chores would quietly be done by someone else the next day. A loaf of bread left behind by a customer might be found on someone's step, even if that someone had refused to eat for 2 days straight. These were not gestures of love. They were gestures of familiarity, of shared fatigue, of the peculiar bond that forms when suffering is consistent and solitude is interrupted not by rescue, but by routine. And still, through it all, There were those who came in seeking more than what was offered, men who thought their coin could purchase confession. That proximity bought permission. They would ask her where she learned to touch so gently, as if tenderness were a skill that could be explained. She never answered. The truth was, she hadn't learned it. She had simply unlearned everything else. What no one understood, what no one wanted to admit, was that this alley operated not in opposition to society, but in tandem with it. The market sold goods, the church sold forgiveness, the tavern sold forgetting, and this alley sold attention, temporary, practiced, and precise. And still the city denied it, pretended these women lived elsewhere, or not at all. City officials passed edicts from towers high above, demanding modesty while their own boots left familiar prints outside these doors. Records from the time list women by number, not by name. A census might refer to them as public women or women of the night, as if daylight dissolved them, as if the sun made them untrue. But they were real, and they were consistent, more consistent than the merchants who moved towns, or the lords who changed borders, more constant than the law. They remained, even when no one wanted to admit they had ever arrived. Historians still debate whether these spaces functioned as safety valves for patriarchal control, or as marginal zones where women carved out forms of agency under the guise of submission. Some argue the women were exploited. Others argue they navigated a narrow power, learned to wield it like a blade dulled at the edge but sharp at the hilt. The truth, as usual, lives somewhere in between. They weren't heroines, they weren't villains. They were tired, clever, bruised, hungry, and still here. And the rules they followed, those invisible threads that held this strange, soft web together, were more durable than most charters, more flexible than most laws. They evolved when they had to. They were rewritten when needed, not with pen or parchment, but with the small, constant choices women made when no one was watching. It's easy to imagine now, from the safety of distance, that such places were shadows tucked beneath history's hem. But the reality was more mundane, more intimate. The wooden walls, thin as they were, held stories as potent as any fortress. The beds, creaking and narrow, bore witness to more confessions than any confessional. The curtains, once vibrant, now dull, still fluttered at the edge of each transaction, framing scenes no one drew, no one honored, but everyone remembered. And if you listen closely, you might still hear the sound of someone whispering the rules to a new girl just arrived, just afraid, just beginning the long forgetting that survival requires. She wasn't the first to arrive too young. She wouldn't be the last. Her shoes were still too large. The laces knotted at the ankle just to keep them from slipping off. She carried no bundle, only a thin shawl that had once been cream-colored but now bore the same gray as the sky above. When she walked into the alley, she didn't hesitate. That's what gave her away. The older ones always paused at the edge. The youngest walked straight in because they didn't yet know where they were. There was no ceremony to her entry, no formal welcome, no elder matron to greet her, just a nod from a woman washing linens in a basin, and a space cleared near the hearth. No questions were asked, not because no one cared, but because they had all once stood in that same doorway, unsure whether to speak first or wait for someone to notice. She sat on the stool for an hour before anyone spoke, not because of rudeness, but because silence here was the first test. Could you stand it? Could you sit in a room where every sound meant something, and none of it was meant for you? Could you last long enough without asking to be asked? Eventually, a woman older, not old, placed a cracked bowl of barley soup in front of her. She didn't say, "You're safe now," or eat. You must be hungry. She simply placed the bowl, folded the edge of the girl's shawl inward so it wouldn't drag through the broth, and moved away again. That was the extent of welcome. The girl ate slowly, not because of nerves or manners, but because the last time she'd eaten something warm, she'd scalded her tongue and hadn't tasted anything for 2 days. She had learned to let things cool. That was the kind of education the road gave, unspoken, unkind, but unforgettable. By nightfall, she'd been given a mattress near the back wall. Not a room of her own, there were no spare rooms, just a corner where the plaster cracked in quiet lines, and a candle had burned its shadow into the ceiling. No one said how long she'd stay. No one asked where she came from. The answers to both were the same anyway: not long, and from somewhere forgettable. In medieval towns, girls like her often slipped through the cracks in systems that were never built to catch them. Orphaned by plague, abandoned during famine, or sold by desperate families hoping one less mouth to feed might make winter bearable. She could have come from anywhere. That wasn't the point. The point was that now she was here, and here had rules. At first, she was put to cleaning floors, mostly, and chamber pots, then linens, though never the ones used upstairs. Those were left to the more experienced, the ones who knew not to gag when folding them. The girl scrubbed in silence, not out of obedience, but because she didn't yet know which sounds would draw attention she couldn't afford. She wasn't told what the house was, not directly, but she wasn't stupid. She saw the men come and go. She watched how they didn't meet anyone's eyes on the way in, and how they never looked back on the way out. She saw the candles always burning low in the hallway, never fully extinguished, never fully bright. And she noticed how the women carried themselves, not proudly, but purposefully. Every movement was measured, not as though someone might be watching, but as though they might forget their own body if they didn't control it. On the third night, a girl named Elsin gave her a bar of tallow soap. It was cracked at the edges and reeked faintly of mutton fat, but it was the first thing anyone had given her that wasn't food or fabric. Elsin didn't explain. She just handed it over during washing and said, "Use it on your hands. Your skin will split if you don't." It wasn't kindness. It was knowledge. Kindness would have offered sympathy. Knowledge gave her tools. After a week, she was allowed to help prepare the rooms, folding linens, wiping surfaces, lighting candles. No one corrected her when she placed the basin on the wrong side of the bed. They simply moved it and said nothing. Correction wasn't public here. It happened through absence. When she did things wrong, the task would be given to someone else. That was her lesson. If you wanted to stay useful, you had to notice what wasn't said. Eventually, someone asked her name. She lied. Of course she did. That was another unspoken rule: never give the real one. Real names were for people who had homes that remembered them. She said her name was Mira, though it had never been. Still, once she said it, it became hers, and the others didn't ask again. A name, once given, wasn't tested. Over time, she learned what others had learned before her, that attention could be sharpened into something survivable. That the difference between a bruise and a compliment was often just tone. That a man who left too quickly might return too angry. That when two girls refused the same customer in 1 week, someone would come to ask why. But even amid this tightrope, there were moments that didn't feel entirely bleak. Once, she laughed, truly laughed, when another girl mimicked the pompous strut of the town magistrate, right down to the way he smoothed his robes before sitting. The room had burst into muffled giggles, all of them biting the insides of their cheeks to keep from being overheard. For just a second, the house didn't feel like a sentence. It felt like shelter. And in that fragile space, She began to understand something the sermons would never admit: this place, for all its scars, was still a kind of home, not by design, not by desire, but by default, because no one else had opened a door, no one else had left a stool by the fire. And sometimes, survival is the closest thing to belonging that someone like her ever receives. You think about that as you picture her brushing her hair with a comb someone left behind months ago. The teeth are cracked, but she uses it anyway. She's not doing it for beauty. She's doing it because it's hers now. Because in a world where everything is borrowed, the comb is one of the few things no one has taken. Outside, the alley darkens. The shutters close a little more tightly. Somewhere, a man is deciding whether to knock. Somewhere else, a candle is being trimmed with a dirty blade. And in the back room, the girl Mira now, permanently, no matter what name she was born to, folds a blanket with the precision of someone who has learned not just how to serve, but how to remain. She is not brave. She is not broken. She is not rescued. She is just here. And sometimes that is enough. The church was no more than 3 streets away, its bell tower visible through the mist when morning lifted, casting long shadows across the uneven rooftops. Its chimes marked the hours with the dignity of stone and order, reminding the city of its rituals: mass at dawn, confession before dusk, silence on holy days. Yet those sounds never reached the alley with conviction. They passed over it, as if reluctant to be heard by those whom sanctity had forgotten. She had watched the priests once, early on, back when her knees still trembled at the thought of being seen. They wore white linen, their voices soft and distant, like water flowing where you couldn't reach. They rarely walked past the red light district, unless necessity forced them. And when they did, their eyes locked on the horizon with a practiced intensity, as if by refusing to look, they might also refuse to know. One of them, tall, well-fed, with a tremor in his right hand, had spoken against the women in his sermons. Sin, he called it, filth wrapped in silk. He told parishioners that the city would never prosper while such shadows crept beside its walls. And yet, twice that month, he was seen just beyond the alley's bend, speaking quietly with a girl named Linnet, who never wore shoes unless someone made her. He never entered the house, never lingered long, but each time he left, his face bore the same thin, pinched look, not of guilt, but of hunger unspoken. This was the way of it. The church did not recognize the street, but it relied on its silence. Officially, the women were outlaws. Practically, they were tolerated. Some towns even taxed them. The coin recorded euphemistically in civic ledgers, under phrases like public allowances or domestic oversight. In return, the women were expected not to be seen. Their presence was acceptable only if it remained quiet, invisible, and out of step with the rhythm of daily life. The alley itself bent gently to this unspoken accord. No banners were hung. No laughter was allowed to rise past the chimney line. When hymns drifted across the rooftops during holy feasts, the women would pause their steps, not out of reverence, but routine. You didn't provoke attention. Not here. Not when the veil between pardon and punishment was so easily torn. Mira, still new to the house, had asked once quietly, over a bucket of water, if any of the priests had ever helped a girl leave. Elsine had shaken her head slowly and said, "They help with words, not with doors." That was all. No bitterness. Just the truth, set down like a folded cloth. In truth, most of the women no longer noticed the church, even as its spire loomed overhead. It was a building for other people, other lives, those who hadn't crossed. Whatever invisible line separated the blessed from the tolerated. It was a line that didn't appear on maps but cut deep all the same. Once crossed, it rarely offered a return path. Still, the church's presence lingered in subtler ways. During plague seasons, when fear made even the cobblestones feel suspect, a priest might appear with a cloth over his mouth, swinging incense and muttering prayers as if that alone would cleanse the air. He never looked into the houses. He simply walked the alley's edge, tracing borders he claimed not to recognize. The women never mocked him, nor did they welcome him. He was tolerated, like rain. You waited for him to pass, then returned to whatever task had been interrupted. The incense hung in the air for hours afterward, mingling with the smell of sweat and boiled herbs, clinging to walls like a ghost that refused to choose a side. But not all clergy ignored them entirely. In certain cities, like Avignon or Toulouse, some clerics sought to formalize the trade, enclosing brothels under church supervision, claiming it was better to manage sin than let it spread wild. They argued that containment was a form of mercy, that regulation protected virtue by giving vice a predictable address. These ideas never reached the alley where Mira lived, but the rumor of them traveled far. Some women even dared to wonder what it might feel like to be sanctioned, to be acknowledged, even as a transgression. There was something cruel in being unseen, as if your suffering did not exist simply because it lacked a name in polite conversation. She once dreamed of entering the church not as a supplicant, but as a child might return to an old house to see if it still smelled the same. In the dream, she wore clean clothes and was allowed to sit near the front, her hands folded, her feet still. But even in her sleep, she knew it wasn't real. The doors were carved too high for her, and no one turned when she entered. That was always the part that made her wake up the silence of others continuing on without her. The real cruelty of the church in this context was not its condemnation, but its indifference. It did not rage against the women, it simply did not see them. It offered absolution to men who entered the alley in the dark and confessed it in the light. But for the women, there was no confessional path. To confess implied wrongdoing. To be heard implied worth. Both were in short supply. And yet, in small ways, fragments of belief still remained. A rosary tucked beneath a mattress. A prayer scratched into the underside of a table. Crosses drawn on fogged windows, not to ward off spirits, but to remember a mother who had once whispered those same shapes before sleep. Faith wasn't practiced openly. It was preserved like dried herbs hidden, faintly scented, almost forgotten, but still potent when crushed between fingers. Even Mira, who had never entered a chapel, found herself whispering half-remembered lines on nights when the wind sounded like voices and the shutters rattled with something more than air. It wasn't belief she sought. It was comfort, and comfort, even imagined, was better than nothing. One evening, when the bells rang longer than usual, perhaps for a wedding, perhaps for a death, the women sat in the hallway without speaking. No customers had come. The candles were lit, but no one rose to adjust them. Mira, her knees drawn up beneath her chin, looked toward the high window where the sound drifted in. "Do you think they hear us?" she asked. No one replied immediately. Then Elsin, who had seen more seasons in the alley than any of them, exhaled through her nose and said, "They hear what they want." And that was all. In the medieval red light district, sound traveled selectively. The laughter of children might pass through. The tolling of bells always did. But these voices rarely escaped their walls, not because they were soft, but because the world had stopped listening. And perhaps that was the most enduring silence of all. They never arrived at noon. That hour belonged to fishmongers, chimney sweeps, and the rhythm of a city pretending it had no shadows. Noon was too bright, too alert, too public. Instead, they came when the light turned liquid, when the alley blurred at its edges, and the day exhaled its last obligations. They came at dusk, when excuses could be tucked into sleeves and faces half-lit were easier to deny later. You could always tell the ones who had never been before. Their steps stuttered at the turn, as if they expected the road to rearrange itself into something cleaner. They paused at the wrong door, looked at the wrong woman, hesitated when no one else did. They smelled of lavender and soap too strong, the kind worn by men who bathed more for others than for themselves. They wanted to ask questions, but couldn't form them. Their coins were often too heavy, handed over as if they carried not just payment, but apology. Then there were the regulars men who walked the alley as if it were a corridor in their own homes. They didn't knock anymore. They simply waited, hand in pocket, eyes scanning shutters until the right one opened. They rarely spoke beyond necessity. They didn't ask for names. They never used their own. They came for something simpler than intimacy and more difficult than pleasure, the right to be forgotten for a while. And then there were those who came in shadows, not because they feared recognition, but because they had begun to forget their own shape. Widowers, men sent home from war with missing parts, some visible, others buried under skin, boys who had been too young to marry, now too old to start. These were the ones who stayed the longest, not in the rooms, but on the stairs, their hands trembling as they tried to remember what warmth had felt like when it wasn't bought by the hour. The women recognized them all. They didn't need names. The gait, the scent, the way someone folded their cloak or touched their belt told more than introductions ever could. The worst were those who asked for nothing. They scared even the bravest girls, not because they were cruel, but because they were too quiet, too still, as if they'd already begun to disappear and simply needed someone to confirm it. The alley's reputation, to outsiders, was one of sin and noise, of laughter wrapped in shame. But the truth was quieter. It was restraint, not indulgence. That defined the rhythm of life here. Nothing was said that didn't need saying. No movement was wasted. The girls didn't giggle. The men didn't leer. It was a space made of negotiations far older than law, and much more delicate than most ever imagined. Inside the house, there were habits that made the evenings bearable. Mira, now a month into her stay, had taken to boiling water even when it wasn't needed, just for the warmth. The steam softened the air and kept the windows from icing over. It reminded her of mornings long ago, when her mother had cooked porridge in a battered pot and the room had smelled of salt and linen. In the back room, Elsin always lit 2 candles, never 1, never 3. She said 2 was enough to see and not enough to stare. No one questioned her. Her room was closest to the stairs, and she heard everything first. She'd once told Mira that listening was more important than looking. Ears never blinked. That made them safer. The women took turns tending the hearth. There was no schedule. You simply knew when it was your turn. If you forgot, someone else did it without speaking. If you forgot twice, your blanket went missing for a night. That was the system. It worked. They shared food. Not equally, life here was not fair, but no one went without entirely. If someone had a meat bone from a generous client, it was boiled again for soup. If someone had bread, it was sliced thin. The thinnest slices were saved for Mira. She didn't ask why. She just ate slowly and said thank you in gestures, wiping the table, darning socks, heating water before anyone else woke. At night, the house sighed, not all at once, but room by room, breath by breath. Footsteps softened, doors clicked shut. The last candle guttered. In the quiet that followed, The women lay still, not necessarily sleeping, but not restless either. Rest was a kind of currency too. When it came, you spent it carefully. Once, Mira asked what happened if a man became violent. Elsin answered without turning her head. You don't let him close enough. Mira frowned. But what if you don't know until Elsin interrupted? Voice flat. You always know. You just don't always have the time to act. There had been incidents. Every woman carried at least one. A bruise that took too long to fade. A rib that still ached when lifting buckets. A memory that pressed too hard during quiet moments. But no one shared the details. It wasn't solidarity that kept them silent. It was containment. If you spoke it aloud, it became part of the room. And the rooms had enough already. They had learned to protect each other, not with grand gestures, but with small cues. A knock that wasn't quite right, a window shuttered too soon, a candle extinguished before it should have been. Each meant something. Each told someone to wait, to check, to be ready. Outside, the city never asked how the women managed. It preferred stories where they were either victims or demons, never people. The real story was too quiet to be told. It involved nights that bled into mornings, bruises mistaken for birthmarks, laughter that sounded a little too even, and silence that stayed too long after someone left. Historians today still struggle to define these women. Were they outcasts or participants in a social system that offered no other place for them? Did they exercise agency, or were they trapped by circumstance? Perhaps the question itself is flawed. To live here was not to be one thing. It was to exist between roles, to hold contradiction in your hands and try not to drop it up. The medieval red light district was less a place and more a negotiation. It hovered between visibility and denial, morality and survival, shame and necessity. It was an arrangement between those who had desires and those who could not afford to reject them. And in that space, in that fragile balance, lived 1,000 untold stories, none neat, none complete, all real. Tonight, another man will come. His boots will creak louder than necessary. His eyes will scan the alley too quickly. He will carry the same story all the others brought, one of want, of loss, of something he can't name. He will hope that in being touched, he might remember who he is, or forget who he was. And a woman, maybe Mira, maybe not, will open the door, not with welcome, but with familiarity, because in this street, familiarity is the closest thing to kindness anyone can offer, and for some, that will be enough. If your eyes are fading, let them. The story wasn't waiting for anyone. There was never a record book, no proper ledger or scroll, but the city knew exactly what it was owed. Taxes arrived the way winter did not sudden, but certain, and the alley was no exception. The collection was not formal, and the language used was never official. Yet everyone understood. Once a month, sometimes more depending on the mood of the men in uniform, a knock came not at a customer's door, but at the side entrance, where water was fetched and ashes were dumped. It was never a loud knock, but the silence afterward was unmistakable. The guards did not wear armor on those visits. They wore patience. Their hands rarely touched their weapons, but always hovered near. They did not ask questions. They named a number. If the coin was ready, they left. If it wasn't, they stayed longer than necessary, inspecting curtains, lifting blankets, making remarks not quite cruel, but never neutral either. The tax was always collected, one way or another. Elsin once said it was better to pay with copper than with time. Everyone understood what she meant. Time was what they took when the coins weren't enough time in the upstairs room. Time pressed against walls that gave no comfort. time that was never truly given, but taken with the appearance of consent. In those moments, the women were no longer workers. They were currency, and currency does not have the right to object. The younger ones were warned quickly. If the guards came and you had something to give it. If not, disappear into the back. There were hiding places under floorboards, behind the false panel in the pantry, even a crawl space beneath the eaves where only the smallest could fit. Mira had curled up there once, knees pulled to her chest, trying not to cough as the dust settled into her throat. She stayed for nearly 2 hours, long after the voices faded. When she emerged, her hair was filled with cobwebs and her mouth tasted of wood rot, but no one said anything. Someone handed her a cup of water. That was all. It wasn't that the city was particularly corrupt. It was simply human. And humans are excellent at building systems that allow them to look the other way while still benefiting from what they pretend not to see. The guards were not cruel by nature. They were fathers, brothers, sons men paid too little to enforce rules, too vague on people, too voiceless to resist. And when their coin purses felt too light, they came here not out of malice, but out of convenience. There was no use reporting them. To whom would you report? The magistrate who sent them, the priest who spoke of sin while pocketing donations from the same men, the clerk who documented fines against disorderly women without ever asking what that disorder had looked like. No, the alley did not go to the city for help. The city came to the alley when it wanted to collect. But even within that imbalance, there were boundaries, unspoken, shifting, fragile but present. If a guard stayed too long or touched too roughly, someone else might step in not to stop him, but to remind him that everyone had to return eventually. No one wanted to become the story told too loudly, the name whispered too often. Reputation was currency, even here. Some of the women found ways to negotiate. Small gifts left on windowsills, an apple, a dried flower, a pair of woolen gloves in winter could soften a collector's demeanor. Elsin was particularly adept at this. She never flattered, never flirted, but she remembered birthdays, the names of children, the injury one man sustained from falling off a cart during harvest season. These details made her seem real to them, and real people are harder to hurt. Not impossible, but harder. Mira, still learning the intricacies of this strange diplomacy, once asked whether it felt degrading to be so polite to men who could turn cruel without consequence. Elsin had stared at her for a long moment before answering. No, it's not polite. It's calculated. Kindness given freely is charity. Kindness used to survive is a tool. There were moments, of course, when calculation failed, when the coin ran short and the guards came impatient. Those nights were long. No one spoke of them afterward, not because of shame, but because of uselessness. Nothing could be fixed. Nothing could be undone. It was like frost damage to a crop. You counted what you had left and planted again if you could. And still, the next morning, the water was fetched, the linens were scrubbed, the front steps were swept. To anyone passing by, it was just another day. That was the point. To erase the previous night so thoroughly that even the air couldn't remember it. The medieval red light district, for all its reputation, was often more ordered than the world outside. It had rhythms, schedules. Even the taxman came predictably. Unlike the men who arrived for other reasons, the women measured time not by the bells of the church, but by footsteps they could identify by weight alone. They knew which boots meant trouble and which meant routine. They knew how long it took for a coin to be placed on the table, how long it took to be picked up again. This was a kind of knowledge no one taught, but everyone acquired. Historians today have access to ledgers and court records, but these tell only fragments. Fines levied against unnamed women for disturbing the peace. Notes about houses ordered to be closed for the health of the city. But between the lines is a truth more constant than policy that as long as there was power to be held, there would be those who extracted it from the powerless under the guise of duty. Yet even within that extraction, the women carved spaces of their own. Some saved what they could, a coin hidden in a shoe heel, a scrap of parchment bearing a name only they knew how to find again. Others saved nothing, choosing instead to invest in comfort where they could warm slippers, a soft comb, a cup that didn't leak. These were victories, small and silent, but victories nonetheless. And then there were those who had given up trying to keep anything for themselves. They lived moment to moment, hour to hour, their faces blank, not from numbness, but from too much feeling pressed into too little space. They didn't cry. They didn't smile. They simply moved, like clock hands that ticked, whether you watched them or not. When the guards left, the house exhaled. Not relief. Exactly, relief implies the danger is gone. It was more like a temporary release from tension. Shoulders lowered. Voices returned. The door was bolted again. Not to keep anyone out, but to remind the house that it still belonged to them, however briefly. And as Mira folded the coins into the cloth pouch beneath the stair, she wondered, not for the first time, whether survival was itself a form of rebellion. Not dramatic, not loud, but insistent, steady, unwilling to yield, because the tax was always collected. But what they didn't take, what they couldn't calculate, what no ledger ever recorded, was the refusal to vanish. And in this house, that refusal echoed louder than any bell. She had changed her name again. No ceremony marked the change. No announcement was made. It simply happened, quietly, as most things in the alley did. The women noticed, of course. They always did. One day, the name spoken over the threshold wasn't Mira, or Lyra, or Thea, but something new, soft and barely whispered, like breath on glass. And no one corrected her. That was the rule. You never questioned a new name. You used it, folded it into your tone, and let the old one slip away like a splinter in water. Changing names wasn't a deception. It was a shedding, a survival strategy as old as the street itself. Names were fragile, especially the ones given at birth. They belonged to other lives, lives where girls had fathers, who spoke gently in rooms with sunlight not dimmed by soot. To keep those names was to keep a door open to something that could no longer be entered. So they changed them, not because they were hiding, but because they had already been found and needed a new space in which to endure. Elsin had once been called Berna. She only admitted it after 3 cups of warmed wine and a night when no one else had spoken. She didn't say why she changed it, and no one asked. There were too many possible reasons, and none of them required confirmation. What mattered was that she answered to Elsin now, that she had chosen the syllables she could live with. The rest was ash. Some of the girls changed names every season, like coats, like hairpins, like habits. It wasn't about confusion. It was about control. In a world where very little belonged to them, their names, however temporary, were theirs to shape. They chose ones that sounded softer, or stronger, or less like what had once been shouted at them in another life. The clients rarely noticed. Most didn't care. They weren't listening closely enough to hear the difference between Myra and Myra, between Lena and Lena. If they asked at all, it was only to give the illusion of interest. Names, to them, were props in a performance they mistook for intimacy. But for the women, each name carried weight. A name could make you feel older or younger, more foreign or more invisible. It could be armor or invitation. Some chose names that sounded like flowers. Others chose names from stories told once and half remembered. One girl called herself Silence. No one laughed. Mira, though, that wasn't what she was calling herself this week, kept her new name to herself for 2 days before saying it aloud. When she did, it was not a declaration, but a murmur during candlelight. She was tending to the hearth, brushing ash to one side, and Elsine asked if the water had boiled. Yes, she replied, then added, and it's Risa now, just so you know. Elsine didn't look up from her stitching. She nodded, threaded the needle again, and said, All right, Risa, that suits you better. Nothing more needed saying. The practice wasn't confined to the alley. Across medieval towns, women who worked in shadowed trades, whether in sanctioned brothels or informal rooms above taverns, adopted aliases to protect themselves. It was a kind of veil, a thin one perhaps, but enough to offer space between the body and the world's assumptions. In some cities, authorities demanded registration under a known name, while in others, the women were left nameless by law, recorded only as numbers or initials in dusty ledgers. But here, where the alley resisted formal oversight, names flowed like the smoke from their candles, never still, never anchored. To outsiders, it might seem chaotic, even dishonest, but to the women inside, it was a quiet kind of order, an ecosystem of chosen identities and relinquished pasts. Each time Risa Mira changed her name, she also changed something else, her way of sitting, the tilt of her head, the pace of her steps. She became slightly different, like a melody transposed into a new key, not unrecognizable, but shifted, enough that she could look in the cracked mirror by the stair and see someone worth rehearsing. The mirror itself was old, its silver faded, its frame nicked by time and careless elbows. It reflected more suggestion than detail, but that suited the women fine. Too much clarity could be dangerous. Better to see yourself softened. Better to be reminded not of flaws, but of outlines, a suggestion of form, a silhouette of survival. Names weren't the only things that shifted. Memories did, too. The past, when spoken of at all, came in fragments. No one told stories from start to finish. They offered corners, edges, flashes of color. I had a brother. Once he liked ducks. Or we used to have a pear tree that dropped fruit so heavy it split open on the ground. These weren't meant as invitations for sympathy. They were offerings, small reminders that there had been something before the alley, even if that something had been brief. And sometimes, when the wind pressed too hard against the shutters and the fire burned low, one of them would sing, not loudly, not cheerfully, just enough to be heard by those who had chosen not to sleep yet. The songs were never bawdy. They weren't the kind sung in taverns or festivals. These were lullabies, funeral chants, melodies so old they had no language left. You didn't need to understand the words to know what was being mourned. Risa sang once, only once. It was after a night when a man had left too soon and too loudly, his boots clattering down the stairs like he wanted the world to know what he'd done. No one asked what had happened. No one tried to offer comfort. But Risa sat by the hearth, her eyes closed, and hummed something low and strange and lilting. When she stopped, Elsine handed her a cup of warm broth. Nothing was said. The name Risa was never questioned again. The world outside continued on, unchanged. The baker still shouted about his fresh loaves. The blacksmith still cursed at the apprentice who bent nails with too much heat. The church bells still marked time with precision and pride. But inside the alley, time moved differently. It curved. It bent toward the women who refused to be defined by its demands. And Risa, whatever her name might be next week, learned to walk that curve with something close to grace. She no longer flinched at sudden noises. She learned to laugh without smiling, to speak without revealing, to rest without falling asleep too deeply. She had become what the alley required, not invisible, but untouchable. Perhaps that is the strange paradox of this place, that in a space defined by transaction and exposure, the women learned how to preserve something no one could purchase. Their names, their memories, their pain all shifted, all disguised, but none erased. It was an act of quiet rebellion, as steady as breath. The alley didn't keep records, but it remembered. It remembered each name spoken, each one replaced, and it held them not with reverence, not with pity, but with a kind of bone-deep knowing. These were the truths the city pretended didn't exist, that the women who changed their names were still whole, still thinking, still choosing. Because choosing to rename yourself, even when the world insists on calling you what it wants, is not a lie. It is an act of staying alive. Letters never reached this street. The postal routes of the medieval world, limited though they were, followed paths of trade, law, and lineage. Messengers carried news between abbeys and manors, between kings and councils, between merchants who dealt in silks and spices. But no one wrote to the alley. No one expected a reply from it, even if someone had wished to send a message, perhaps a brother searching for a lost sister, or a mother holding on to hope it wouldn't have arrived. There were no official addresses here. No one kept account of who came or went. The alley lived beneath the map, and the ink of bureaucracy never reached its edge. And yet, once, a letter did come. It was wrapped in rough linen, sealed with wax already cracked. The name on the outside was smudged, but recognizable enough that it reached the hands it was meant for, or at least believed to be meant for. Elsin was the one who found it tucked under the door early one morning, before the city stirred, before the fire had been rekindled. She turned it over once, twice, said nothing, and passed it to Risa, who had just returned from fetching water. Risa held it without speaking. It had been years too many, perhaps since anything had arrived with her name on it, or any name that she recognized as her own. For a moment, she didn't open it, not out of fear, but out of disbelief. The idea that someone, somewhere, had remembered her in ink felt impossible. In this place, memory lived in objects, gestures, silences not in words. When she finally unfolded it, the parchment was brittle, its creases white with age. The writing was clumsy, as if the person had struggled to find the right letters. It was short, a single sentence. In fact, if you are still alive, the river still waits. There was no name, no date, nothing else. She read it again and again, not because she didn't understand, but because understanding came too easily. The river. A memory buried so far beneath everything else that it surfaced like something pulled from a deep well, heavy, wet, and shimmering with fragments of light. In her childhood, there had been a river, not grand, not mighty, but enough to hold secrets and summer. She remembered skipping stones from its banks, the way the water twisted around her ankles when she stepped in, the way her mother's voice carried across the surface when she was called home for supper. The river had been the last place she had seen her brother. He had left upstream, chasing rumors of work in a bigger town. She had not followed. Until now, she had not heard from him again. No one asked what the letter said. Elsin didn't press. The other women looked once, then looked away. In the alley, privacy was the most expensive currency, and when someone held it, the others knew to protect its weight. Risa folded the letter carefully, too carefully, like it might crumble if handled with anything but reverence. She wrapped it again in its cloth and placed it in the small chest beneath her bed, a chest that held only 4 other items: a cracked comb, a ribbon, a dried orange peel, and a spoon made of tin. The letter joined them as if it had always belonged. She did not speak of it for days, not even to herself. But something in her shifted. She moved more slowly, not with fatigue, but with a kind of listening, as if her body was waiting to hear something else arrive, another word, another sign. And though nothing came, she began walking to the edge of the alley in the early mornings, just before the baker lit his fire. She would stand there, not quite stepping out, but not entirely staying in. Her eyes would scan the street, not for someone in particular, but for something, a ripple, perhaps in the dust, a change in the pattern. Letters were not meant for women like her. That's what everyone believed. That's what society had taught. They were for merchants confirming orders, nobles arranging marriages, lovers with enough distance to write desire. Not for the nameless, not for the ones who'd rewritten their stories so many times that nothing legible remained. But the letter had arrived, and with it, a reminder that somewhere, someone remembered her not for what she did, but for who she had once been. It unsettled her, not because it brought hope, but because it stirred grief she had carefully silenced. She had not allowed herself to long for return. That was dangerous. The alley did not permit nostalgia. Longing was a sharp edge, and sharpness led to injury. And yet, every night, she read the letter again. She never cried while reading it, but once, she pressed it to her face, not to feel the paper, but to remember that ink had been used, ink, time, effort for her. The other women, for their part, respected her silence, but their eyes watched. They watched as she began brushing her hair more deliberately. They noticed she folded her garments at night instead of letting them fall where they may. They heard her humming again, not songs of mourning this time, but tunes with rises, dips, and half-forgotten refrains. None of them said anything. Words would have broken the spell. And then, one evening, just before the lamps were lit and the streets began to cool, she asked a question no one had expected. Have any of you ever left? The air shifted, not alarmed, not skeptical, just shifted. Elsin looked up first. She didn't answer immediately. She placed her needle down, smoothed the thread with 2 fingers, and said, "Once, but I came back." Why? There was nowhere else where I was expected. That was the end of it. Risa didn't reply. She simply nodded and resumed her task. But the question had been asked, and in that question, something began to move. The medieval red light district did not encourage movement. It depended on stasis, on return, on routine. It offered predictability, and in doing so, it discouraged escape. The women knew this. Most had tried to leave once, maybe twice. The world outside, however, offered no handholds. Their pasts did not welcome them. Their skills were not in demand elsewhere, and safety, even one wrapped in shame, was still safety. But that letter, it made the past feel like something still breathing, not gone, just waiting. And perhaps that was the most dangerous thing a letter could bring. If this held you a little longer than expected, you're not the only one. This is Boring History Nights. They called it the room with the red candle, though the candle itself had long since lost its original color. Time and smoke had darkened the wax into something closer to rust, and the wick burned low, casting an amber light that stained everything inside with the hue of old memory. The candle sat on a small wooden stand, scarred by years of careless elbows and the heat of cups left too long in place. No one remembered who first placed the candle there. No one questioned why it had never been replaced. But the flame was never allowed to die, not because of superstition, but because some rituals are too embedded in the walls to be undone without consequence. It wasn't the largest room in the house, nor the warmest. The bed frame creaked with even the lightest touch, and the mattress sagged in the middle like a tired breath. A single window looked out over the back alley, its shutters warped and stubborn, admitting only the narrowest strip of light in the mornings. The walls, once painted some pale shade, had faded into the color of ash and wear, and yet, for reasons no one articulated, this was the room everyone used when nothing else felt certain. It wasn't reserved for special clients. It wasn't avoided, either. It simply existed, a space that carried the weight of unspoken history. The kind of room that remembers more than it reveals. Girls were sent there when they were unsure, when they needed silence more than company, when the world outside had leaned too hard and left its imprint beneath the skin. Risa had not yet worked the red candle room. She had passed it often, always with a glance that lingered just a second longer than it should have. Something about the light unsettled her, not because it frightened her, but because it felt familiar in a way that suggested grief rather than recognition. Then, one evening, Elsine asked her to prepare it. Not with ceremony, not with instruction. She simply handed Risa a folded cloth and said, "It's the red candle tonight." Risa nodded, took the cloth, and made her way up the stairs with a heaviness she couldn't quite name. She entered slowly. The door groaned on its hinges, as it always did. The candle was already lit. No one admitted to lighting it, but it was always burning by dusk. Risa placed the cloth on the edge of the bed, smoothed it, and began arranging the space. She did it the way Elsine had shown her weeks ago: basin to the left, folded linens at the foot, cup near the window, never on the stand. The candle must remain untouched. As she moved, she noticed the smell of the room, a mixture of wax, sweat, dried lavender, and something else, something older, like paper left too long in a damp drawer. It was not unpleasant, just aged, lived in, like the room had exhaled stories so many times. It no longer remembered which breath belonged to whom. By the time the client arrived, Risa was seated in the corner chair, hands folded in her lap, not waiting so much as bracing. He was older, not quite frail, but with a hesitation in his step that suggested discomfort with the ritual more than the act. His eyes scanned the room quickly, then landed on the candle. He said nothing. He removed his gloves, placed them beside the door, and sat at the edge of the bed, not looking at her, not looking at the wall, just sitting, as if trying to become small. This wasn't uncommon. Many came not for pleasure, but for something quieter, something they could not name aloud. Company, perhaps. A moment where they didn't have to explain. Some talked, some did not. Some cried without making a sound. Risa had seen all of it. Tonight, this man said nothing. She rose slowly, crossed the room, and poured water into the basin with care. The sound of it, steady, controlled, seemed to calm him. He took off his boots, then lay down on the bed fully clothed, one arm over his eyes. Risa did not move closer. She returned to her chair and sat. The silence stretched, but not uncomfortably. It thickened like the warmth in bread just out of the oven settling, not suffocating. After a while, the man spoke, voice rough, as if words had not been used recently. "Do you keep the candle burning because of someone?" Risa looked at him, not directly, but enough. "No, we keep it burning because of everyone." He nodded once, then no more was said. In cities like Bruges or Florence, there were documented rituals surrounding certain rooms in brothels or houses of negotiation. Some rooms were reserved for those in mourning, others for men returning from war. In some places, a red candle outside the door signaled that the client should not be disturbed, that what occurred inside was not to be interrupted, not because it was important, but because it was fragile. This room carried none of those official markers. And yet, the candle told the same story, that this space was not for transaction, but for reckoning. And reckoning was not loud. It was not cruel. It was a whisper between two people who had nothing to give each other but the promise of not being alone for an hour. Risa sat there until the man's breathing slowed. She watched the candle burn, the wax pooling at the base, flickering slightly as the air shifted through the crack beneath the door. Her mind drifted not to the past, but to the letter still folded beneath her bed, and the river it had summoned into her memory. She thought of water now, not fire, but both had a way of leaving traces that couldn't be scrubbed clean. Eventually, the man stood. He didn't look at her. He left the coin on the stand beside the candle, a break from the rule, but she didn't correct him. He gathered his gloves, paused at the door, and then said, so quietly she nearly missed it, "Thank you for not asking." And then he was gone. Risa did not move immediately. She waited until the flame had stilled again, until the echo of his steps disappeared into the hall. Then she rose, pocketed the coin, and turned the linens gently, not changing them yet, just adjusting, making the room ready for the next silence. As she moved toward the door, she paused. The candle still burned. It would burn until morning. That was the way of the room. It was never extinguished until daylight touched the floor. Some say that memory lives in the scent of a place, not its sight or sound. If that is true, then the room with the red candle held a memory none of the women dared name. It belonged to everyone and no one. It waited without judgment. And for those who entered, it offered not absolution, but recognition. If you've started slipping out of it, keep going. The past barely noticed you were here. Winter, when it arrived, did not knock. It seeped through the gaps in the shutters and under the doors, thick and certain and without apology. It entered the alley not as a storm, but as a slow possession. First came the numb fingers, then the brittle lips, then the way everyone's voice seemed to grow quieter, not from reverence, but from conservation. Breath had to be saved. Warmth had to be preserved. The houses adapted. Straw was stuffed into the cracks between boards. The hearth was kept burning past midnight. Blankets were doubled and then tripled, even if it meant sharing them with someone whose scent lingered long after the body was gone. For the women of the alley, winter was not just a season, it was a client. A cruel one, demanding, relentless, always taking more than it gave. And unlike the others, it did not leave coins behind. It lingered in the walls, in the marrow, in the voice that no longer wanted to speak when morning came. There was less work during these months. Men stayed home, their desires muffled by frost and proximity. Wives, children, and neighbors made shadows longer, excuses harder. Even the most familiar footsteps in the alley became scarce. Those who did come carried snow on their cloaks and stiffness in their posture. And when they undressed, it was with the desperation of someone bargaining with the cold, not the body. Intimacy was not the aim, heat was. Some women took to wearing extra skirts beneath their dresses, not for modesty, but for insulation. Others lined their boots with rags soaked in animal fat, a trick borrowed from field hands and charcoal burners. Risa began sleeping with a brick wrapped in wool at her feet, heated in the fire and carried up carefully each night. She'd learned the method from a girl who'd since disappeared, leaving behind only the worn blanket Risa now used. The house's routines changed. Mornings became slower, harder. No one wanted to rise first, to expose their fingers to freezing water or breathe in air that hadn't yet been touched by flame. But someone always did. It was the way the house worked, a shifting rotation of obligation. Elsin often rose first, out of habit, not virtue. Her knees ached more in winter, and she said that movement made the pain tolerable. Whether or not that was true, no one questioned it. Pain, like snow, made its presence known without needing to speak. There were no fires upstairs. The rooms retained whatever heat they could from the body, from breath, from the closeness of two people pressed into the same bedding. Sometimes, after a client had gone, the woman left behind would curl herself tightly in the dented mattress and lie still, stealing what warmth she could before it faded. Not because it was sentimental, but because it was efficient. Even used heat was better than none. Food became simpler. Hard bread soaked in broth, onions fried in leftover fat, lentils stewed until they no longer held their shape. Nothing was wasted. Bones were boiled twice. Peelings were dried and burned. When someone brought back apples or dried figs, it was a cause for quiet gratitude. No celebration, just the brief comfort of something sweet amid the salt and smoke. Despite the hardship, no one complained. Complaining required energy, and winter hoarded that too. Instead, there was a tightening of habits, a closing of shoulders, a turning inward. Stories were told less often. Songs fell silent. Even laughter, which sometimes bloomed in the shadows like a defiant weed, became rare. One night, Risa was asked to see a man who had come from across the river. He was wrapped in furs, his beard thick with frost, and his eyes darted like those of someone who had been watched for too long. He smelled of pine resin and wet wool, and when he entered the room, he did not remove his gloves. He did not speak much. He asked if there was wine there was not, and then sat by the window without unfastening his cloak. Risa stood nearby, unsure whether to approach. The silence between them grew thick, then thinned again, stretched like thread pulled too tightly. Eventually, he said, "I don't want anything. I just wanted to sit somewhere where no one knows my name." Risa said nothing. She understood. She brought him a cup of water and lit a second candle, not for brightness but for warmth. They sat in silence for nearly an hour. When he finally stood to leave, he placed 3 coins on the table more than necessary and whispered, "For the fire." Later, she left the coins on the mantel, unclaimed. No one touched them until morning. The alley in winter was not loud. There were no street songs, no drunken arguments. Even the cats went quiet. Their cries softened into mewls muffled by snow. The world seemed to wait for warmth, for spring, for something other than survival. And yet, the house endured. Women came and went, but the structure remained. It remembered. It bent to accommodate sorrow, stiffened to withstand cold. The beams cracked sometimes with the shift in temperature, echoing through the halls like the groans of something old and unwilling to fall. But it held. They said that winter separated those who lived here from those who merely passed through. A woman who could endure the season without bitterness, without breaking, had found a kind of rhythm that couldn't be taught. Not resilience. Exactly something quieter, something closer to patience sharpened into shape by necessity. Risa began keeping a log of sorts, not written, but memorized. Each morning, she would count the things that remained: the full bucket, the unbroken dish, the unburned half candle, the boots still mended, the hand still steady when she poured tea. She counted not to be grateful, but to track continuity, to remember that she was still present. That winter, though cruel, had not claimed her yet. Historians, when they speak of women like her, often discuss resilience in abstract terms. They talk of adaptation, of coping mechanisms, of the evolution of marginalized survival. But what they miss, often, is the intimacy of cold, the way it settles in your clothing, in your breath, in your joints, in your silences. They forget that winter is not just endured, it is negotiated with. Each hour a fragile truce. In one forgotten ledger, there is a line that reads, "The women in that part of town do not receive alms during frost." It is followed by a note, "They have chosen their path." But winter did not feel like a path. It felt like a test, one that never fully ended. And those who survived it, who woke up each morning and moved toward the fire without ceremony, who wrapped themselves in shawls that smelled of wood smoke and memory, were not saints or victims. They were people who endured quietly, invisibly, without reward. If none of this is making sense anymore, you're exactly where you should be. She arrived without a name, or at least, without one she would give. The others called her Ash, not because of the scar which was red, not gray, but because of the way she sat, always curled near the hearth as if she belonged to it more than to the room. Her hair was the color of soot soaked in wine, her voice barely louder than a breath drawn through cloth, and when she walked, it was with the cautious rhythm of someone who had once stepped too quickly and paid for it. No one asked where she had come from. In this part of the city, arrivals were not questioned. You came, and if you stayed, that was enough. The scar was shaped like a hand, not a fresh one, not blistered or angry, but healed over time into something permanent, something raised and slightly shiny, as if her skin had memorized the moment and chosen to carry it forward. It curved just beneath her collarbone and disappeared under her left shoulder. She never covered it, not fully. Even when wearing her wool shifts or laced dresses, the burn would peek through, as if declaring its presence to the room before she ever spoke. She didn't smile, not at first, not because she was unfriendly, but because she didn't seem to know what her face was allowed to do anymore. She listened more than she spoke. She cleaned quietly, folded linen with exact precision, and poured water as though each drop had consequences. When she moved past Risa in the hallway, she always nodded once, never bowed, never paused, just nodded. A small, private agreement that they were both still here. The others whispered. They always whispered, though never in cruelty, just curiosity. Was she a runaway? A noble's daughter, punished for something unspeakable? Had she set the fire herself, or had someone else held her down? Risa didn't ask. She didn't need to. Some silences told their stories more clearly than words. Ash May never took clients. Not in the beginning. Elsin didn't force her. She never forced anyone. But there was an understanding in the house if you did not work. You kept busy. And Ash did. She scrubbed floors until they glowed like wet stone. She repaired a dozen garments in a week, her stitches fine and nearly invisible. She relit the hearth before anyone else stirred and kept the kitchen knives so sharp that they cut without sound. But it was the children who made her speak. They came in pairs, mostly orphans, pickpockets, the younger siblings of girls upstairs. They were allowed near the house, but not inside unless there was a reason. One winter afternoon, a boy with frostbitten fingers had been carried in by a frantic older girl who worked the corner near the tannery. Ash took the boy's hands in hers, warmed them slowly between cloth and breath, then rubbed them gently with bear fat, all without saying a word. When the boy cried not from pain, but from the sudden presence of warmth, Ash had pressed her forehead to his and whispered something. No one heard it, but the boy stopped crying. After that, the children looked for her. They waited outside in the alley just to watch her pour wash water or catch her eye through the cracked shutters. Some left gifts: a button shaped like a fish, a single green berry, a carved piece of bone polished smooth. Ash never asked why. She simply collected them in a tin and kept them near her pillow. One night, near the end of a storm, a man arrived asking for the girl with the scar. No one had spoken of it to outsiders. Elsin narrowed her eyes. The man insisted he had heard of her from someone who owed him a debt, that she was good with pain, that she understood silence. He offered a coin the size of a dove's eye. Elsin said she would ask. Upstairs. Ash sat by the window, her knees drawn to her chest, staring at the snow melting into mud below. Risa delivered the message with care, framing it not as command but as curiosity. Ash didn't respond at first. Then she stood and walked to the mirror, a cracked shard of glass hung between two nails. She adjusted her collar until the scar was hidden completely. She did not flinch. She did not sigh. She said only, once. The man stayed an hour. No one heard anything. When he left, he did not speak. Ash returned to her spot by the hearth. Her eyes were dry, her breath even, but her hands shook when she reached for the poker. That was the only time she ever agreed. She became part of the house's rhythm, not one of the loud ones, not one of the broken ones. She existed like the ash in her name, soft, settled, and everywhere. She was the one who woke first when someone cried out in their sleep, the one who knew how to bind a wound without asking how it came to be, the one who sat with you if your mind began to splinter, and never once told you it would be all right, only that she was there. Years later, when her name was still not known, and her face had taken on the stillness of stone rubbed smooth by time, a young girl arrived, barefoot and shaking, holding nothing but a tattered doll and a slice of burnt bread. No one spoke to the girl, not at first, but Ash knelt before her, reached out a single hand, and placed it over the child's heart. "You'll be cold for a while," she said, "but you won't be alone." The girl nodded. She did not cry. They gave her a new name that night, and Ash gave the doll a new dress made from the hem of her own shift. In forgotten ledgers and dusty court records, there are brief mentions of women like her healers without training, mothers without children, saints without prayers. They are footnotes, never headlines. But the women of the house remembered her differently. They remembered the way she stitched skin and cloth with equal care, the way she carried fire, not in her mouth, but in her presence, the way her silence made space for others to breathe. Not every woman in the red light district gave herself away. Some simply gave warmth, safety, steadiness. Ash was one of them. And in that district, in that house, that was enough. If your thoughts are fading and the silence feels heavier than your breath, let it. You're safe here, now. They came in twos, always twos, never alone, never as friends. When the men of the church entered the red light quarter, they did so in pairs, one to knock, the other to witness, one to speak, the other to hold the silence like a torch. Their robes brushed the wet cobblestones like judgment itself, long and dark and impossible to ignore. You could smell the incense on them even outside the alley, clinging to wool like smoke after a fire. The house had been visited before, of course. There were sermons carved into the side doors, splinters of scripture tucked between shutter slats. Someone once smeared holy oil on the threshold. Another time, they left behind a bundle of ash and feathers tied with red thread, a curse, maybe, or a prayer. But this time, it was different. This time, they came with parchment. Elsin answered the door. She did not bow. She did not flinch. She let the robe in, and the second one lingered just behind him, eyes drifting across the lintel, as if the wood itself were an affront. Risa watched from the top of the stairs, holding a cup she had no intention of drinking from. The air was still. "We've received complaints," the man said, though his voice had no heat. "Only recitation. This establishment continues to operate during the fast." Elsin didn't respond. She let the silence stretch until it creaked. The priest cleared his throat. "It is forbidden. To take coin for flesh in the weeks of Lent is to commit double sin. It is also forbidden to starve," Elsin said. "I wonder which god counts that." It wasn't defiance. It was observation, dry, practiced, without bite. The priest didn't answer. He handed her the parchment, heavy with wax. "This is your first warning." Elsin took it, nodded once, then turned and shut the door without another word. The second priest didn't even blink. He stepped back as the door closed, already turning away. They had done what they came to do. That evening, Elsin did not read the notice aloud. She fed it to the fire. The wax hissed. The parchment curled into black. No one asked what it said. They already knew. For the next week, things quieted even more. Some of the girls left town altogether, walking toward the next village or taking shelter with cousins who owed them favors. Others simply refused clients, claiming fevers or toothaches. The house operated on half its breath. Risa cleaned more, swept corners that hadn't seen bristle in months. Ash spent long hours sewing, her fingers moving with mechanical grace. But not all the women could afford stillness. The church's words didn't pay for soap or onions or candles. And though the priests barked of repentance, they did not offer bread. It was the girls who fed themselves, with dignity or without. So on the third night, when a man arrived, smelling of wine and boasting a coin with a bishop's face on one side, Risa took him upstairs. She did not ask his name. He did not ask for hers. But when he stumbled as he removed his boots, she caught him gently by the sleeve, and for a moment, he looked at her like a man seeing the stars for the first time from the bottom of a well. Later, after he left, Risa washed her hands in silence. The water was cold. It made her knuckles ache. She thought of the bishop's face, stamped in bronze, watching her from the table where he'd tossed it. Elsin never asked what went on in each room. It was one of the quiet kindnesses of the house. There was no ledger, no tally, no record of favors done or endured. The only accounting was in the pantry how much salt remained, how low the oil had fallen, and even those shortages were met without reproach. But the pressure grew. The priests returned again in twos. This time, they lingered in the street, just far enough not to trespass, but close enough that their presence could not be ignored. They stood beneath the archway and sang, not hymns, but proclamations, warnings, promises of divine wrath. They held crosses aloft like shields, though no one threatened them. The women stayed inside. Even the children did not loiter that week. In the evenings, Elsin spoke quietly to each of the girls, not with orders, but with truths. "You can go," she said. "If you wish, there's no shame in leaving." Most stayed. They had nowhere else to go. And so the house remained not in rebellion, but in persistence, like a weed in stone, like a candle that refuses to go out even when the wind leans hard against the window. One afternoon, a letter arrived, not from the church, but from the city steward. It stated, with elaborate formality, that any dwelling engaged in lewd commerce within 20 paces of the cathedral would henceforth be subject to taxation and surveillance. There was no trial, no room for negotiation. The words were carefully chosen, legal, final. Elsin read it aloud this time. Then she folded it and set it on the mantel. No one spoke. No one needed to. The message was clear: you may exist, but you may not thrive. And that was always the real sin, wasn't it? Not the body, but the fact that it could be used for survival, that it could resist collapse by its own resourcefulness, that these women, who were supposed to disappear, could instead persist. That night, Risa did not sleep. She sat by the fire with Ash, both of them awake but saying nothing. The flames whispered against the logs, the only voice allowed in the room. Finally, Ash said, "They want the house to feel shame." Risa nodded, "But houses don't feel—" "No," Ash agreed, "but we do." They sat a long time after that. In history books, the edicts of clergy are preserved in ink and ivory. Their laws are copied, their warnings recorded. But the women who endured those warnings, their names are dust, their choices, footnotes at best. What remains is not their crime, but their quietness. Not their rebellion, but their refusal to vanish. And sometimes, when you walk a certain kind of alley, even now, you can feel the memory of places like that, not because they echo, but because they held. Held against the cold, held against the church, held against forgetting. If your eyes are heavy and the fire is only a warmth behind your thoughts, you're safe to drift now. The priests have gone. The house still stands. And you're still here. You wouldn't notice her first. That was part of her gift. While others courted attention in silk and scent, she lingered at the edge of the room like a pause in conversation, soft-spoken, unhurried, waiting for the night to settle before stepping into it. They called her Mare, not short for anything, just Mare, like the quiet water in the harbor before a storm. No one could remember when she had first appeared. One day, she was simply there, folding linens, cleaning wax from candle trays, smiling as if the world weren't always watching. But it was the smile that paid the rent. Not a wide grin, not a laugh, not the painted thing you'd see in the taverns. Her smile was smaller than that, closer, as if it belonged only to the one who saw it. It was not an invitation, but a recognition, the sort of smile you gave to someone who had not been spoken to kindly in years. Men remembered it more than the shape of her hips, more than the way her voice dropped when she said their names. They remembered that smile because it made them feel less alone. And that, in this part of the city, was worth more than coin. Mare didn't take many clients. She didn't have to. A handful of visits a week. Always the same men. Never the loud ones. Never the ones who smelled of power. Hers were the ones who came late, asked no questions, and stayed only long enough to warm their hands and whisper something into the dark. Some wept. Some trembled. Some simply slept, curled like children in the hollow of her back. And when they left, they always left something behind: a carved charm, a sprig of lavender, once even a piece of lace wrapped around a single copper bead. She kept them all in a wooden box beneath her bed, tucked between two folded tunics and a wax-sealed letter she never opened. No one asked what she charged. Even Elsin didn't know. But every week, without fail, Mare placed her share on the kitchen table, always the same amount, always on time. No negotiation, no reminders, just a folded cloth and a silence that spoke of discipline. Some of the girls envied her, though they wouldn't say so. Risa, ever practical, watched her with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Ash, who understood the currency of presence, liked her instantly. They shared tasks, sometimes Mare washing the floors while Ash scraped soot from the hearth. Neither spoke much, but their quiet fit together like a lock and key. But not everyone approved. There was a girl, Leyte, who had come from a grander house in the West Quarter, with jeweled combs and lacquered nails. She had been taught to smile a certain way, to walk as if each step were a performance. She thought Mare's plainness was a kind of insult to the art. One night, Lette cornered her by the stairwell. "You don't even try," she said. "You just sit there and let them hand you their hearts." Mare looked at her for a long moment, then replied, "I don't want their hearts." "Then what do you want?" Mare thought about that. "To be left in peace," she said. Lette scoffed and stormed off. But the next day, she watched Mare a little differently, not with contempt, but with a hint of something closer to respect. Mare was not without her own ghosts. There were nights when she walked the corridor after everyone else had gone to sleep, her feet bare, her hands clasped behind her back as if holding herself together. Risa once caught her standing at the top of the stairs, staring at the front door, unmoving for nearly half an hour. She didn't ask why. In this house, you didn't ask about long silences. Sometimes, Mare sang, not songs from the taverns or the churches, but something older lullabies with no words, melodies that felt carved from fog. The girls didn't know where she had learned them. They just knew that when Mare sang, no one raised their voice. Even the walls seemed to lean in closer. Then, one winter, a man returned. He had been one of hers, one of the quiet ones years ago. No one remembered his name, only that he always brought pears in spring and never looked anyone in the eye except Mare. But he came back changed, not in clothes or beard or age, but in manner. He walked with the authority of someone who had inherited something vast. When he asked for her, there was no softness in it. Mare agreed, but not as before. She led him to her room without a word. No candles, no scent, just her and the man, and the hush that clung to them both like dust. He was louder than she remembered, not in voice, but in the way he moved, pressing, impatient, as if he had come not for comfort, but for conquest. When he reached for her shoulder, she flinched. Only once, but that was enough. He stopped. "What's wrong with you?" he asked. She didn't answer. He laughed, sharp and sudden. "You used to be kind." Mare tilted her head. "I used to be quiet." He left in a storm of slammed doors and muttered curses. The next morning, Mare rose early. Her bed was made. The wooden box was gone. She didn't speak of it, but from then on, she did not take clients. Not once. Elson didn't argue. She simply adjusted the books. Risa offered her extra laundry work. Ash sharpened her sewing needles. And Mare remained not as a girl for hire, but as something else. A keeper of calm. A listener. A hand that passed you the bread when you had no strength to reach. Years later, when the city began purging the quarter, when the houses were shuttered and the walls whitewashed and the women scattered like coins from a fallen purse, no one could find Mare. Some said she had left with a sailor, sailed west into fog and freedom. Others claimed she married a baker, bore 7 children, and forgot the life behind her. But Risa knew better. Mare didn't run. She didn't vanish. She simply stopped being where others could see her. Because peace, when earned, is not loud, and hers had always been quiet. If your mind is still wandering and your eyes haven't quite closed, let them. You are not required to stay awake for every story. Some, like Mare, ask only to be remembered gently and without need. You don't remember who first told you about it. Maybe it was Ash, when she was drunk on cough wine and soaking her feet. Maybe it was whispered by a client in the dark, lips brushing your shoulder like regret. Or perhaps it was only something you heard in the silence between footsteps, a space no one entered unless they had to. The room without windows sat at the end of the hallway. No one swept. Its door had no handle, only a warped iron latch that creaked like old ribs when moved. No name on the frame, no flowers near the sill, no candle ever lit beside it. And yet, it was not abandoned. The sheets were always clean. The water basin inside was always full. Someone tended it. Someone made sure it was never quite forgotten. You passed it often, pretending not to glance sideways. You told yourself it was just another storage room, or maybe a place where old blankets went to sleep. But the truth it carried was heavier than that, and everyone in the house felt it. Elsine called it the still room, not for quiet, but for what it held: still memory, sorrow, maybe even consequence. When a girl could no longer work but refused to leave, she was given the room. When someone bruised without asking how the room took them in. When the church was watching too closely, and a name needed to be removed for a while, it was erased behind that door. It wasn't punishment, not exactly, but it was never sanctuary either. Once, a girl named Benna stayed in there for almost a month. She had bitten a lord's son when he reached too far and too fast. He struck her. She struck back harder. The boy's father sent men to ask questions, and Elsine moved Benna to the still room before they even arrived. You tried to bring her soup on the third night, but the door didn't open. No voice answered, just a pause. So you left the bowl on the floor, and by morning, it was gone. When Benna finally came out, she didn't speak for days. Her eyes darted like mice in daylight, and she flinched at the sound of laughter. It took her weeks to hum again. She never spoke of what happened inside. No one asked. Sometimes it wasn't about protection. Sometimes the room simply held what no one else wanted to carry. There was a rumor that the floor was uneven, not because of the foundation, but because something had been buried beneath it long ago. A girl, they said, who refused to be sold to the bishop's steward. Some said Elsine herself put her there. Others claimed the girl never existed. Only the story did, and that was enough to make the room heavy. But even Elsine looked away when someone mentioned it. It was Ash who broke the silence once, when a storm had locked you all in for days, and the wine had thinned everyone's tongue. "I stayed in that room once," she said, not looking up from her stitching. The others stilled. "I wasn't hurt," she added, "but I hurt someone else. With a word, not a knife. And it was Elsine who told me to go in, sit, and wait until I knew how to live with what I'd said." Risa frowned. "And did you—" Ash looked up then, her eyes glassy and too bright. "I still don't know." After that, no one mentioned it again for a long while. But the room was always there like a held breath at the end of the hallway, never let out. You finally entered it, years later, not because you had to, but because you chose to. Elsine asked nothing. She simply nodded when you told her. "I'll keep your chores warm," she said. And so, one dusk, when the alley smelled of iron and someone had screamed outside without consequence, you stepped through the iron latch and shut the world behind you. It was smaller than you imagined. A low cot, a jug of water, a stool, nothing else. No mirror, no writing slate, no voice but your own heartbeat. The walls were thick, not soundproof, but sound deep. They didn't block noise so much as swallow it. You could hear your own bones. You didn't cry the first night, or the second, but by the third, the quiet undid something in you. Not grief, not guilt, just unraveling. You remembered every name you tried to forget, every door you closed too fast, every kindness you left hanging in the air. You whispered to the floor. You paced. You sang a song your mother once hummed, though you couldn't remember all the words. You slept. You woke. You stayed. And when the time came, when your own silence began to feel less like punishment and more like permission, you opened the door and walked back into the house. No one asked how long you'd been gone. No one asked why. But Risa hugged you that night when she thought you were too tired to notice. Ash gave you her softer needle, Elsin, in her way, simply handed you a fresh cloth and said, "Kitchen's out of salt." And you smiled. Not because it was over, but because you were still here. The still room had not taken you, only held you long enough for you to hear your own voice again. Not all houses have such places. Not all houses allow you to disappear without dying. But this one did, because for all its roughness, the brothel was still a kind of family, bent and bruised and shame-wrapped, yes, but stitched together by the choice to stay, by the rituals of survival, by the unspoken pact that no one would be thrown away. Even the room without windows had a place in that. It held what the world refused to make room for. It held you, and tonight, if your thoughts are curling into themselves like old smoke, and your chest is rising just a little slower than before, that's all right. You don't need a window to rest. You only need a door that closes gently, and the courage to open it again when you're ready. It was meant to be a night of celebration. That's what they told you. A night when the town forgot what it was, and for a few hours, wrapped itself in color, in noise, in the illusion of joy. Once a year, the streets behind the square were lit with torches, their flicker turning soot-stained walls into something golden. Children wore paper masks. Butchers sang with bakers. Even the magistrate's wife smiled at the fishmonger's daughter. It was called the Feast of the Saints, but the saints had very little to do with it. In the brothel, it was both the busiest and loneliest night of the year. Every bed would be filled, every face painted, every hem sewn straight, every dish doubled in case the coin flowed well. Even the roughest girls put a ribbon in their hair. Ash had been preparing for weeks, practicing her dance in the kitchen with bare feet and a stolen tambourine. Risa braided her curls tighter than usual. Mere, of course, refused to dress up, but she cleaned the front steps until the stone shone, and laid a row of tiny flowers on each window ledge. Even Elsin softened, just slightly. She allowed sweet wine with breakfast. A mercy. But you weren't sure if you belonged in the room or outside of it. The townsfolk flooded the streets by sunset. You could hear the pipes and drums, the chatter of children hopped up on honey cakes. You stood in the upper window, forehead against the pane, watching the crowd swirl like fabric being spun. Red, blue, gold. The wind carried the smell of fire-roasted meat and damp roses. The air itself felt lifted, like it had risen just slightly above the pain it usually carried. Elsin opened the door behind you. "You should get ready," she said, not unkindly. You nodded, but didn't move. There was something about the way the night looked from up here, something too far away to touch, but too real to ignore. A life that didn't include waiting for someone else's hands to decide your worth. Downstairs, they laughed. A rare sound, full of forced hope. You dressed? You always did. Not in the red, like Ash. Not in green, like Risa, but in a deep blue tunic with sleeves a little too long. You liked how it felt like you were being held. Your client was late, then later, then simply didn't come. Elsin gave you a look, but said nothing. You offered to help in the kitchen, but it was full. So you stepped outside, just for a moment. The air hit you like a story from a book you'd once been told, full of promise and a sadness too wide to name. Torches lined the narrow roads. People danced in circles, their shoes slapping stone like rain. No one looked at you. That was its own kind of gift. You drifted through the crowd like a ghost that hadn't yet made up its mind about staying. A boy, no older than 15, pressed a rose into your hand and ran away without a word. A woman in velvet tossed her head back and sang so loudly it made 2 dogs bark. A man in priest's robes kissed a butcher's wife and laughed when she slapped him. And all around you, the town pulsed with something more alive than you'd felt in months. But even joy has edges. You saw it in the girl who sat alone by the fountain, wiping her mouth. In the child who reached for a sweet and was slapped away. In the way the music sometimes faltered, like even it knew it was pretending. You sat on the edge of the well, not because you were tired, but because it was the only place no one expected you to be anything but still. From here, the house looked small. A lantern flickered in Mare's room. Ash's laughter rang out like a bird startled into flight. You felt the rose in your hand wilt. There had been a time when you believed the festival might be yours. When you thought you'd wear a mask and someone would see you, not the girl from the brothel, not the coin on legs, but you, entire and unnamed. But that was before you learned how the world looks at women like you when the music stops. A boy stumbled past, shouting something about saints and sin. He didn't see you. You were grateful. The stars overhead were fewer than you remembered, or maybe the smoke from the torches had blurred them. Either way, you stopped looking. When you returned to the house, the front door was open. Music still poured from the parlor. Ash was spinning in someone's arms. Risa had red on her cheeks that wasn't blush. Mare was in the corner, watching, holding a teacup with both hands as if it might break. Elsin caught your eye. She didn't smile, but she nodded the kind of nod you gave to someone who came back from the edge without falling. You went upstairs, undressed, washed the soot from your neck, sat on the bed and held the dying rose until its stem bent like a sigh. Outside, the festival roared, but in here, the quiet was thick and warm. You weren't part of the night, but you weren't forgotten either. You lay down, not because you were exhausted, but because sleep was the only thing no one could charge for. And somewhere, beneath the noise, beneath the perfume, beneath the song, the real you, the oldest version, the one that came before all of this, curled deeper into the dark and listened for silence. It came slowly, like a kindness, like the end of a long story with no clear moral, like the breath you didn't know you were holding. Tonight, you did not dance, but you survived. And in this world, this corner of history where joy is borrowed and peace is rented by the hour that was enough, it began like any other night with the sound of ash being scraped from the hearth, the creak of the roof timbers adjusting to the cold, the scent of boiled onions lingering in corners where candlelight couldn't reach. The girls whispered through the walls, finishing their chores with the sleepy rhythm of repetition. Someone was singing 2 doors down, soft and off-key. You don't remember the tune, only that it seemed to unravel by the second verse, like she had forgotten how it ended. In the brothel, routine was armor. You folded sheets the same way each time. You counted coins twice before placing them in the drawer. You brushed your hair 30 strokes, not because it helped, but because that's what Elsin told you to do. Discipline, she said once, is the only thing they can't touch. But tonight, the routine thinned. Risa hadn't come back. She was due before sundown. Her client was a merchant from the coast, always prompt, always brief, never unkind. He brought her fig cakes once, left a comb carved from bone the time before. He was not the sort to forget or linger. And yet, the lantern outside was still unlit. Her shoes were still under the cot. Her scarf, the pale one with red stitching, still hung on the peg near the door. You didn't want to worry. Girls ran late. Sometimes they stayed the night for more coin. Sometimes they were asked to. But Risa wasn't the kind to stray. She was careful, cautious, even. She kept a pin in her boot and always walked home with her braid tucked into her cloak. She wasn't brave. Not like Ash, not like Mare, but she was aware. And that awareness had kept her whole in ways boldness never could. By candle's 3rd inch, Elsie noticed. She didn't raise her voice, didn't panic. She simply stopped stirring the stew and said, "She's late." Ash looked up from darning her stocking. Mare froze mid-step, a tray balanced in her hands. You said nothing, just felt the quiet knot behind your ribs begin to twist. We wait until moonrise, Elsine said. If she's not back by then, we ask. Ask. Who? The magistrate, the guards who laugh when you walk by, the other girls who sell favors in darker alleys for less coin. Everyone knew the brothel girls disappeared from time to time. It was part of the life, a warning, written in the margins of every contract made without a name. You went to Risa's room. It still smelled like her soap and smoke, and something floral she brewed from orange peel. Her book lay open on the windowsill, a sprig of thyme marking the page. Her cup had water in it, half emptied, with a lip stain still visible along the rim. She had meant to return. That was the thing that broke you. This wasn't a girl who'd fled. She hadn't taken her coin stash, or her cloak, or even her second pair of shoes. She'd left her life exactly where it was, as if she'd simply stepped out to breathe. But the night deepened, and she didn't return. Elsine lit the outer lantern, a signal, a kind of prayer. You watched it sway in the wind, its flame dancing too high for comfort. You imagined Risa seeing it from the road, imagining that she'd smile, touch her chest like she always did when grateful, and quicken her step. You waited. You told yourself she was only delayed. You told yourself 100 things, but none of them kept the silence out of your throat. Ash stood beside you for a while, arms crossed. She didn't speak, didn't cry, just stood there, like if she looked hard enough into the dark, she could pull Risa out of it by will alone. She knew better than to trust him, she said finally. You didn't ask who. She didn't mean the merchant. That was the other truth of nights like this. The men you feared most were never strangers. When Elsine left with her shawl pulled tight and her lips a hard line, you stayed behind. Not because you weren't afraid, but because someone had to tend the fire. Someone had to hold the place warm in case Risa returned, blinking and cold and smiling like she'd been foolish to worry anyone. You sat by the hearth. 1 hour, 2. The wood popped. The stew cooled. Ash fell asleep with her cheek against the table. Mare didn't come down at all. The night stretched long, and Risa did not come back. When Elsine returned, her shoes were wet, and her face gave nothing away. She's not in the square, she said. No one's seen her since dusk. You didn't ask what else she found. If there were signs, if the innkeepers lied, if the guards laughed, if the alleys carried stories. You didn't want to know, because whatever it was, it wouldn't bring her home. Instead, you did what Risa might have done. You folded her blanket. You lit her candle. You placed the fig cake one she'd hidden for herself beside her cup. Not because she'd eat it, but because you needed something to offer to the space she left behind. The girls mourned in their own ways. Ash sang that same unfinished song, softer this time. Mare opened the window and let the wind in, just enough to feel like maybe it could carry a whisper. Elsine didn't speak her name again, and you made a pact. You would remember the sound of her laugh, the way she always counted her steps on the stairs, the way she curled her toes under when nervous, the way she used her fingertips to measure how full a glass was. You would not let her vanish entirely, because that's what the world did to women like Risa. It forgot them, politely, efficiently, without guilt. But here, in this crooked house, among girls who wore other names and other histories, memory became a kind of rebellion. So you remembered, and every time a lantern was lit at dusk, you imagined her walking home, slower now, changed, but whole. You left the fig cake there for 3 days. Then you ate it, because grief must eat too. And when you did, it tasted like ash and honey and something that almost felt like peace. You had always been told that a fire in the hearth meant safety, that as long as the flames danced behind the iron grate, No harm could come to the girls sleeping upstairs. The hearth was the heart of the house, they said. The coals could be coaxed back to life, even from embers, even from ash. You'd believed that for a while, or wanted to, because the thought of that fire dying out was worse than the chill it was meant to keep away. But on this night, the fire burned low, and no one rose to tend it. The house was too quiet, not the quiet of sleep, but the kind that follows after a scream, a hush full of things unsaid. The boards groaned beneath your feet as you crossed the floor. You held your shawl tighter, though the cold wasn't what made you shiver. The fire had been left alone too long. Its shape had sagged into embers and collapsed logs, heat still pulsing, but without form. You knelt beside it, poked the wood gently, tried to breathe life into the coals. Sparks jumped, then faded. The wood sighed but didn't catch. You added kindling, waited. The flame stirred like a child resisting sleep. And then it rose, reluctantly, a thin orange tongue flickering against the dark. Behind you, Ash muttered something in her sleep. Mare had not come downstairs in 2 days. Elsin had not left her room. There had been no clients since Risa disappeared. A few knocks at the door had gone unanswered. A shadow paused by the window last evening, but when you looked, it was already gone. No one said it out loud, but the house had turned inward. It mourned the way old houses do not with tears, but with drafts, with things going missing, with windows refusing to stay shut, with cups cracking for no reason. You sat by the fire, watching it rebuild itself with the help you'd given. There was something comforting in the way flame worked, how it needed breath, attention, time, how it returned what you gave it, if not always in the shape you hoped for. You thought of Arisa's hands, how she used to warm them like this, palms open to the flame, her eyes half closed, pretending to be somewhere else. She had always said she hated winter, said it made her bones too loud. Now, winter had moved in. It sat in the corners. It watched you from the dark. That night, you didn't speak much with the others. Ash stayed curled in her corner, her face turned toward the wall. Mare had locked her door from the inside. Elsine's steps above creaked only once before falling silent for the rest of the night. So you kept the fire alive, not just for warmth, but because you didn't know what would happen if it went out. Hours passed. You read old letters by firelight, some your own, some left behind by girls who no longer lived here, notes scribbled in haste, apologies, lists of things to remember: apples, soap, ribbon. One had a poem written in the margin, smudged almost to nothing. You imagined the hand that wrote it, the mouth that whispered it the first time. Did she get out? Did she mean to? The fire flared suddenly, a small burst of life from a knot in the wood, and it startled you more than it should have. Sometimes, even hope surprises you. You stood to stretch. Your legs were stiff. The air beyond the hearth's reach was sharp, like walking into someone else's grief. You moved toward the back window, lifted the curtain slightly. The alley behind the house was empty. No movement, no cats, no wind. Just the sound of your breath and the echo of nothing returning it. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang. Not the hour bell. The other one, the one they only rang when someone was found. Not every town used it, but here they did, out of a twisted sense of ritual. You froze. You counted. 1 toll. 2. Then silence. It could have meant anything, but in your chest, something closed. You went back to the fire. It was smaller now, but steadier. The kind of flame that had made you believe things once. You thought about the girls upstairs, the ones who'd taught you how to survive, how to keep your face still, how to smile without meaning it, how to listen for footsteps and guess the mood before a door opened. You thought about how much of yourself you'd lost to this house, and how much it had given in return. It wasn't love, but it was something like shelter. You placed another log on the fire, not because it was cold, but because the sound of it catching was something you needed to hear. Footsteps on the stairs. Slow, measured. You didn't turn. You didn't have to. Elsin stood beside you. For the first time in days, she didn't look like a ledger. She looked like a woman, older than you'd thought, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "She's not coming back," she said. You nodded. You didn't cry. That would come later. Maybe never. "You can go," she added, "if you want." It took a moment for you to understand. Go where? The world beyond the house didn't want girls like you. Not without a price. Not without some other name. Some other lie. "I don't know where I'd go," you said. "That's still better than here," she replied. But even as she said it, she sank into the chair beside the hearth, as if she too had nowhere else to be. The two of you sat there for a long time, not as madam and girl, just as people, the fire between you, the silence all around. It wasn't peace, but it wasn't pain either. When the coals finally dulled again, you both leaned forward at the same time, added wood, waited for warmth. And in that small act, that reaching, that tending, you found something like a future. No promises, no safety, just the knowledge that the fire could still burn. And sometimes that was enough. It wasn't the kind of leaving that begins with doors flung open or bags packed in haste. No one wept in the doorway. No one handed you a scarf with trembling fingers. The house didn't cry out after you. The shutters didn't bang in protest. When you finally left the brothel, it was as quiet as a thought you almost didn't finish having. You woke up before dawn, though you hadn't really slept. The candle you left burning had melted down to its base and flickered once before dying in silence. The coals in the hearth were nearly cold, but not quite. They glowed like the last heartbeat of something already lost. You stood and dressed slowly, not because there was much to choose from. There never had been, but because you were trying to let your hands remember what it felt like to do something without fear. You wrapped your shawl tight around your shoulders and traced one finger along the window frame. There was frost there, a thin silver memory of the night before, and behind it, the street was empty. No footprints, no carts, no reason to stay. You didn't take much, only what would fit in the satchel Elsin had once given you to collect linens. A cracked mirror, a comb with 3 missing teeth, Risa's little bone charm that you still kept wrapped in linen, a dried bit of time. You left the rest. Let the house have it. There was a note, if it could be called that, not to Elsin, not to the others, just a scrap of fabric with a smudge of ash across it, folded once and left on the table. It said nothing, but the way you placed it said everything you couldn't speak aloud. You stepped into the hallway. The floor creaked beneath your bare soles, just like always. The air smelled of wax and old stew. Someone was snoring faintly, Ash. Probably. Mare hadn't come out of her room in days. Elsin's door was half cracked, but you didn't look in. It felt wrong to say goodbye. Words had always meant so little in that house. What mattered was who brought tea when you were sick, who stayed quiet when you needed silence, who lent you a comb without asking questions, who lit the fire even when no one was watching. And that had been enough. But now the house felt like a skin you had outgrown. You opened the front door slowly. The hinges held their breath. Outside, the world was gray with morning, the kind of morning that makes you forget that stars ever existed. Cold settled on your cheeks like a blessing or a warning. You stepped out anyway. No one saw you leave. That was a mercy, or maybe it was an insult. You walked. You didn't know where to go, but walking itself felt like a choice. The streets were still wet with night's memory. The stones slick beneath your boots. You passed the baker's window dark still, the butcher's stall shuttered tight. A stray cat watched you from under a bench, its eyes reflecting the pale morning like coins too small to spend. Your legs felt heavier than they should have. Each step carried more than the one before, but you didn't stop. The brothel shrank behind you without protest, and for the first time, the air in your lungs didn't belong to that house. There were places you thought you might go, an old cousin on the edge of town, though she barely remembered your name. A monastery 2 villages east that took in women, though what they asked for in return was another kind of silence. You didn't decide that morning. You just moved. By the time the sun scraped the edge of the eastern sky, you had passed the edge of town. And still you walked. You passed a field where frost still clung to the low grasses, sparkling faintly in the dawn light. You paused there. Let your fingers brush the tops. Cold, brittle, real. And then there it was, a bird song. Just one, faint and late, but alive. And in that sound, for a brief moment, the heaviness in your chest loosened. You remembered something Risa once said, "We carry ourselves out of the fire. No one does it for us." She had been brushing your hair when she said it. You didn't know then how much of her was already planning to leave. You didn't know she wouldn't get the chance. But you remembered the way her voice had trembled and the way she pressed a comb into your hand like it was armor. You still had that comb. It was cracked. Useless, almost. But you had kept it anyway. You reached the edge of a wooded path. It wasn't a road, exactly. Just a worn trail marked by wagon ruts and broken twigs. But it was a direction, and sometimes that's all you need. You turned onto it, heart beating strangely. Not fast, not slow, just steady. Like it was finally remembering how to keep going. The trees closed in overhead, branches bare, sky fading to silver. And you whispered her name not loud, not to summon, but to carry. Because what no one tells you is that when a woman leaves a place like that, she never truly leaves alone. She carries every room she slept in, every girl who held her hair when she was sick, every secret kept behind closed doors, every laugh stolen in the kitchen while bread burned in the oven. They stay inside you, not as scars, but as maps. You walked, and the world didn't stop for you. The wind didn't pause. The sky didn't brighten suddenly in reward. But still, something had shifted. Not because you were free, but because you had begun, and later, much later, maybe you would find a place with no lock on the door, where the heat in the hearth was not borrowed from your own fire, where your name didn't have to change with each season, where the only thing expected of you was to breathe. But for now, this road soft, uneven, cold was enough, because this morning you had left, and that meant everything.